Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute promoting a free and virtuous society. I'm Mark Townsend, producer. You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as previous episodes of Acton Line at acton.org/podcasts. If you have a comment or an idea for a future episode, you can email us at podcast@acton.org. Acton Line is available to stream on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and acton.org.
Welcome. My name is Dan Huger, Librarian and Research Associate at the Acton Institute, and today I'm joined by Dave Hebert, returning guest. Love it. Senior Research Fellow at AIER and an Affiliate Scholar here at Acton. Dave is one of my favorites. I always say, are you up for economic potpourri? And Dave says, smells nice. Dave, thank you for being with us.
Oh, thanks so much for having me today.
So we got a new year. Do we have a new economy? So how did the United States finish 2025 in terms of the sort of standard economic growth, employment, market performance, all the things that people usually think about when they talk about the economy, even though that's not all of the economy.
Right. So, right now we're still waiting on fourth quarter GDP figures to come out. They should be out sometime next week or the week after. I forget the BLS's exact release calendar right now. So for some context, we're recording this on January 14th.
Yep.
So those that last quarter's growth rate has not come out just yet. Mm-hmm. What we have seen, though, are the Q3, Q2, and Q1. So remember that Q1 actually shrank. Right, GDP went down in Q1 of 2025. It resurged in Q2, and it resurged again in Q3 with that headline, 4.3% quarterly growth rate.
Everyone was talking about that.
Yeah. So here's what I did, and it's somewhere on my Substack.
Yep.
And so I went through and de-annualized those quarterly growth rates, and then annualized the total. Mm-hmm. Which is a ridiculous sentence to say.
Yes.
But at the end of the day, what it came out to was through the 3 quarters of data that we have so far, we grew at about 2.4%. Now, that's compared to 2.8% for 2024, right? So the growth rate did come in a little bit lower. Now, if we get above 4% again, which the Atlanta Fed is forecasting 5%, which is remarkable, then we will exceed the 2.8% average for 2024. Now, that's a great question about, what is GDP actually measuring? Is it, actually measuring how well off people really are? Because at the end of the day, people do not eat GDP growth rates, right? They eat food, and to get food, you need a job. And so with the jobs data, that's a bit muddier.
Yeah. The latest that I saw was that jobs are being added, but that the rate is a little under what we would hope for.
Yes. So generally speaking, we look for somewhere around 100,000 jobs per month as sort of the job growth rate. And what that means is not that there are, 100,000 more jobs every single month. It means that there were 100,000 or so job openings, right? Mm-hmm. So like if you left your job here and you went and took another job, the net number of jobs in the economy is still the same. But you would see kind of, Dan had a new job. That's a new job in the job data, right? Yeah. And so when we see a lower, number, what we've seen lately is about 50,000 per month, right? So that's well below sort of the normal, about 100,000 or so that we usually see. What that 50,000 number means, especially when we combine it with the insight that the unemployment rate is staying roughly consistent, right? It's gone up a little bit, but not by like an alarming amount. What that means is that we're in sort of this low hire, but also low fire equilibrium. Yep. Okay, and that portends a lot of challenges. So one thing that economists love to point out is that 0% unemployment is actually really bad. Mm-hmm. And it's not bad because like we want people to get fired or anything like that. We want people to have the confidence that if they were to lose their job, they could get a new one fairly quickly. Mm-hmm. And what that means in the context of labor is that the worker actually has a lot more of like the power, right? So if there were no new jobs out there, Chris Morin and Steve Barros, your bosses here at Acton, they have tremendous power over you.
Yep,
right?
we'd just be in the Acton pen.
Right. You'd just be stuck, right? There'd be no viable alternatives for you to go find a new job, should you want to. Not that you want to, right? But if you did, right, there wouldn't be anything out there because there would be nothing for you to do. Well, that gives your bosses a lot of power. Contrast that with if it's really easy for you to go get a new job, you have the power, right? You can tell your boss, no, I'm not going to stay late. No, I'm not going to work extra without getting paid extra, right? That's a tremendous position to be in. It's very helpful to have exit options. And so anytime we see the unemployment rate fall below, let's say 3-ish%, the exact number changes based on conditions. But anytime we see it, too low, that gives us a lot of concern that the bosses or the employers have the power in that dynamic because we don't see that quit rate high. What we're in right now is a situation where people are not leaving their jobs. They're not being fired, but they're also not leaving their jobs to go find a new one, right? Because there are so few jobs actually out there right now. And so that is a tremendously worrisome situation to be in. We want to see more jobs added every month so that people have exit options.
Yeah. So this is like a very complicated and very mixed picture that you're painting on both of these things. The one thing that I asked about that we haven't talked about yet is the market, the stock market. And that is a very rosy picture.
Yes.
So when we think about how should we think about the relationship between the market, the stock market, and the economy at large? Because a lot of folks will say, look, I'm looking at my 401k, think like numbers going up.
Yeah.
Like my net worth's growing. A lot of politicians who, would much rather talk about how the market's going up than about this more complicated picture you painted of the entire economy. Why are those things not necessarily, all pulling in the same direction all the time?
Right. So I think the best way to view sort of the relationship between how the economy, which I basically mean like how people are doing, right? How people are doing in the stock market, right? Is that it's loosely correlated, but there's wiggle room in there. So when the stock market goes down, that's almost never going to be a good thing. Mm-hmm. When the stock market goes up, that can be a good thing, right? And so what we're seeing right now is the stock market going up. And yet millions of Americans who are not in the stock market or who don't have those 401ks. The last I saw is something like 40% of the American people are not invested in the stock market at all.
You need to get in there, folks.
Right. So that's a huge, number. Now, I will say a lot of that 40% are, people under the age of 25. So I'm not overly concerned about, a 23-year-old, let's say, a recent college graduate who is paying off student loans, looking to find a new job. The fact that they can't throw any money into the stock market right now, that's not a huge concern to me. It is a concern, but there's bigger fish for them to fry than putting some money in the stock market. So when the stock market goes up, it absolutely benefits quite a few people, but it doesn't benefit everyone. And it doesn't benefit everyone equally or in a commensurate way that actually puts food on your table. Remember, people eat food. We don't eat stock markets, right? Stock markets are an important thing. They tell us how much investment is going on in the economy, but they don't actually tell us how much food is on the table.
Yep. So there's potential public policies going forward that can affect this in every sort of which way. What has been in the news lately is monetary policy. President Trump very much wants to see interest rates lowered. Jerome Powell was the Justice Department is basically trying to shake down Jerome Powell at this point to affect this. Jerome Powell issued a great response, I think, a great video response that was very professional but very firm, and that these sort of intimidation tactics will not fly with him. And there have been some senators who have come forward and who have cautioned the president on following this sort of track. What is that monetary situation? Does President Trump have a point in wanting rates raised? What are Chairman Powell's concerns? And then what do you make of this sort of kind of shakedown of the
Yeah.
Federal Reserve?
Yeah. So, okay, let's start with monetary policy broadly defined. So,
Yeah.
monetary policy exists as a means to lower unemployment or to maintain what we call full employment, which again is not 0% unemployment, it's a low number, but also to sort of maintain aggregate demand or to stabilize prices. Now, the way the Fed stabilizes prices is by adjusting how much money they're putting into the economy, every quarter, every month, whatever, right? If you put more money into the economy, that's going to cause prices to go up. That's where Milton Friedman gets his notion that, every instance of inflation is really just a monetary phenomenon.
Yep.
If the Fed were to put too little money into the economy, we would start seeing deflation, so prices coming down, right, which is great, but it also means that we're having like income coming down, like all prices are coming down, okay? And so Jerome Powell has to walk a very tight line between two conflicting things. On the one hand, if he wants to bring unemployment down, he's got to pump the economy full of money, but that's going to kick off inflation. Right? So he's in between a rock and a hard place at some point, right? He has to decide which one of those two things he's not going to focus on. And recently, I think it was like last summer even, he decided and pointed out like, hey, we can focus on the labor side rather than the price stability side.
Yep.
So the Fed has famously targeted a 2% inflation rate for a few years now. We've been consistently above it. Right, and we're heading away from it, actually. We went up to, I think it was like 2.7% inflation with the latest figures that came out just yesterday.
Yep.
But that also means that the Fed is trying to help bring unemployment down or to maintain unemployment at a stable level, okay? Where President Trump comes in is he wants to see those interest rates come down. But that would be requiring the Federal Reserve to print and distribute more money into the banking system, which would kick off inflation, okay? And so Jerome Powell is saying, hey, we can lower interest rates a little bit right now. That's what their last Fed meeting did. They lowered it by, I think, 25 basis points, okay? And so there's movement in the direction that Trump wants it to go in, but it's not as quick as Trump wants it to be. Now, in terms of this investigation, I do think it was very politically motivated. The president clearly does not like Jerome Powell, clearly wants him gone, but is kind of stuck with him at least until April or whenever his term is up.
The term is April, yep.
Yeah, but he can stay on the board until 2027, right, as all Fed chairmen can, right? Most choose to resign after their term as Fed chair is over, but Jerome Powell might stay on. Right. And so what the president, I think, is trying to do is find a way to remove Jerome Powell, probably for cause, from the board so that he can appoint a new federal board governor. Okay. Now, is it a political witch hunt? Probably. At the same time, though, we should not use a political witch hunt as an excuse to not investigate the Fed. The Fed is accountable to the federal government at some level. They have to be, cognizant of their role. But they're not elected. And so the Senate does have jurisdiction to oversee what the Fed is doing. If Jerome Powell is truly innocent, which I think he is, I'm not saying either way, this will be a very fast investigation. It'll come out, he'll be exonerated, everyone will say, yep, there you go, and that'll be the end of it. If instead there was wrongdoing, well, then we need to know that. So at some level, I'm not really against the investigation itself, but I do find sort of the motivating factors, which legally are irrelevant, to be somewhat troubling.
And this is a question of cost overruns on a renovation for Federal Reserve building. So it's not an investigation into let's say him doing anything per se with interest rates or things like that. It's unrelated to these other political. It's not directly. The investigation is not directly related to these things we've been talking about.
Right. It's all about did the Fed spend too much money renovating their buildings?
Yeah. So speaking of spending too much money. The Fed is not the only one who's having cost overruns in the government. If they were handing out indictments for this to everyone, the Justice Department would be very, very busy, because the fiscal situation, which is another element of public policy that affects the economy, is not great.
No.
How bad?
Yeah, it's pretty bad. So we're at just over $38 trillion in national debt right now. The deficit, which is the annual overspending, for last year was about $1.7 trillion. For some context, the debt is the total accumulation of all previous deficits and surpluses. As it turns out, there have been very few surpluses, so that part's easy.
Yep.
So when you add all that together, that's how you get the debt. So the deficit goes into debt, right? When we look at national debt over time, it took until 1980 for this country to hit $1 trillion in total national debt. We added $1.7 trillion just last year alone. Okay, so in other words, what? From 1776 to 1980 was 1 trillion. From 2024 to 2025 was 1.7 trillion, right? We are exceeding that one pretty quickly. Now, in terms of, do we see anything that would be evidence that number is going to come down? So that deficit number, right? In other words, are we going to grow the national debt any slower than we currently are? There's not a whole lot out there that suggests that we are. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act is projected to add to the national debt and to increase the deficit. Tariff revenue is certainly higher than it's ever been. That's certainly true. There's no real debate there. We can quibble about where that revenue is coming from, but it's higher, okay? But it's nowhere near enough to pay off the $1.7 trillion in national debt, especially when we're already giving away roughly 40% of it as tariff rebate checks, if we ever see those checks, and when we're bailing out the farmers, right? So remember, we've been promised a lot of checks from the Trump administration. I think Elon and Trump promised something like $5,000 from the Doge dividends, right?
Yeah.
I haven't gotten mine. I don't know if you got yours.
I have not gotten
right?
mine.
And so I would love to spend $5,000, but I just haven't gotten it. Will we get the $1,000 tariff rebate check? We're going to find out together. But if we do, that's all money that's coming out of tariff revenues that's not going to pay off the deficit.
Some of that money could end up going to the Greenlanders, too.
Yeah,
so we don't know.
Yeah, it could go there.
But President Trump's attitude, this is actually from the New York Times today, a great story. President Trump, a lover of tariffs, has become even more enthusiastic about their benefits in recent weeks. In an economic speech in Detroit on Tuesday, Mr. Trump mentioned tariffs more than 24 times, saying the levies have generated trillions of dollars of investment for the country. That followed a series of social media posts in which he credited them for the country's strong economy, its declining trade deficit, and its booming stock market. Quote, the USA markets hit another all-time high, all of them. The president wrote on social media last week, quote, thank you, Mr. Tariff. Are those things we talked about the revenue side of this,
right,
which is actually in the grand scheme of things not that, and it's impressive in terms of,
the number, yeah,
very, very high number, but we've got a lot of high numbers,
right,
that we're dealing with, and it's a drop in that bucket of the other high numbers. Is there any indication that, and again, we talked about stock market is up. Is there any indication from your perspective that it's tariffs that are fueling that? And we talked about the rest of the economy is a more mixed signal. How are tariffs affecting the wider economy?
Right. So this is where who is paying the tariff becomes the relevant question.
Yes.
Okay. And here the data is very unambiguous and very clear. So we can look at things like the import price index. So the import price index, what it's measuring is basically how much our imports costing us to bring into this country, right? They're pre-tariff. So it's kind of like when you go to the gas station and you buy a soda, right? And it says, $2 on the price tag, and you go to the cashier and they'll charge you $2.12, and you don't get up in arms about the 12 cents because that's the sales tax, right? The import price index is measuring that pre-tax price, just like the sticker on the soda, okay? And what we see is that that's staying pretty flat. In fact, it's gone up a little bit, but not by much, right? It's basically flat, okay? If it were the case that foreigners were paying the tariff, that number would come down because foreigners would have to charge lower prices that would then be added, the tariff would then be added to.
Yes.
Right? The fact that it's staying relatively flat is indicative that the tariffs are being paid not by foreigners, but by domestic people. Now, realistically, there are three groups of people that could pay the tariffs. There's the foreigners, which is what President Trump and members of the administration say are paying the tariffs. The data says otherwise. The other two groups are the American consumer, so you and I, right? And then the American importers, or the firms, right? Those are the only three groups that exist. Now, we could subdivide foreign into a whole bunch of things, but that's, for our purposes, those are the three groups. The people in the U.S. who are importing the good, the end consumer, that's it, and the foreigners, okay? That's it. And what we see is that when we look at what's happening to prices, we're seeing about a 20% pass-through rate to the consumer and about a 67 to 75% pass-through rate to the business, right? In other words, American businesses are eating about 67 to 75% of the tariff themselves, right? And they're only passing through about 20% of it to the American consumer in the form of higher prices, okay? Now, if we contrast that to the pass-through rate to the consumer from the first Trump administration, those steel tariffs, there it was only a 5% pass-through rate after a year. Here, it's 20% after about 6 months is when the pricing data came out, okay? And so what that means is that these tariffs are hitting the American people harder and faster than before. All the data that we have right now suggests that American firms are going to start paying less of the tariff and American consumers are going to start paying more. And that's reflective of when businesses have some level of certainty, when they have the ability to renegotiate some deals that they have between the buyer or the importer and the middleman or the store, right? All that is going to be changing, right? As those contracts get renegotiated, as they sunset, right? And we're going to have to renew them. Well, that's going to eat into you and I's pocketbook, right?
So this is a classic case of the seen and the unseen, too. Right. Because if this is the case, that this has been suppressing the profits of firms, more even, an order of, at least one order of magnitude higher than it's been affecting consumers. So to credit these tariffs with the stock market is very counterintuitive when we take that into effect, because what it's actually doing is decreasing the profitability of firms,
right? Which
would be reflected eventually in stock prices,
right? So there's a number of things going on there. So I'm going to purely speculate right now, right? So this is pure speculation. I am not a financial advisor. Don't take my advice, blah, 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 right? So what could be the case is because firm profitability in the U.S. has been hit by these tariffs, and this isn't just me saying it. Scott Bessent said it himself back in May, I think it was, when he said, look, we've got evidence that American firms are eating the tariff in the form of reduced profits, right? He blamed COVID and supernormal profits for, their absurd high profit rate and said, hey, now that COVID profits are over, the firms can eat the tariffs, right? And I wanted to just respond like, well, it's been 3 years since COVID ended, right? Like officially. So maybe that's not what's going on, but maybe, who knows, right? So what we have, right, is a situation where if firm profits are lower, their stock prices are probably falling, which means that what you can do is you can buy now. It's sort of like buying the dip. Right. And what the investors may be betting on is that the Supreme Court is going to strike down all these tariffs in the coming weeks, at which point those firm profitabilities are going to go back up, which means stock prices are going to go back up. So this could be the case that what we're seeing is investors getting in while the firm is sort of hamstrung by tariffs and then betting on the Supreme Court basically striking them down, unleashing American production and seeing all these profits grow. That could easily be what's going on.
This is a question of, how much of everything of this is priced in. This was one of the things after the latest dust up with Chairman Powell, markets opened the next day higher.
Right.
Because market consensus had already sort of priced this in, that this was probably going nowhere for a variety of reasons. But what seemed like a very dramatic showdown in terms of, clips from the videos and those sort of things, markets didn't see as that dramatic because there's a lot of people who spend their careers trying to price in these eventualities into markets.
Yeah. So I mean that's getting into sort of day-to-day movements, which, the stock market on a day-to-day basis will change on a whim, right? Keynes had the idea of animal spirits.
Yeah.
And if you look at things on a day-to-day basis, totally looks accurate, right? But if you look at long-term projections, if you look at what's going on and what you can kind of see, right? Really, the fundamentals of the American economy haven't changed because of tariffs. They haven't changed because of really anything that any president has ever done. The American people, pound for pound, are the most productive people on the planet, bar none. Right now, sure, we have a lot of human capital in the form of a great education system. We have a lot of physical capital in the form of heavy machinery and equipment. Right. We also have tremendous, digital capital or internet capital. Basically, we have a lot of infrastructure that allows us to be super productive.
We have all the leading AI firms.
We have all the leading AI firms, right? And so really, what's going on here is the overall long-term projection of the economy, if you will, is reflecting that. And that, I don't see any reason why anyone should be afraid of how successful the American economy can be in the long run, right? On a day-to-day basis, absolutely. Someone said something weird, right? The stock market could jump, up, it could fall down, all kinds of things could happen. But the long-term projection, to me, is very, very stable. It's very, very robust, right? Because the American people are very stable and very robust.
Let's turn to China.
Yeah.
Because this is one of the things. So there have been these arguments in favor of tariffs on the revenue side, on spurring investment side. We've talked about that a lot. But the other argument is people will make is that this is to combat sort of China's rise and our dependence on China. What's very interesting, another story out in the Times today on China, quote, China announced on Wednesday the world's largest trade surplus ever, even adjusting for inflation, as a tsunami of exports flooded markets around the world last year. China's surplus, the value of goods and services it sold abroad versus its imports, reached $1.19 trillion, an increase of 20% from 2024, according to data released by the country's General Administration of Customs. The number has already exceeded $1 trillion through November. The country's surplus is still widening. For December alone, China's surplus reached $114.14 billion, propelled by surging exports to the European Union, Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. This is not what we wanted.
Right.
This is not what we wanted, is for China to become even more of a manufacturing powerhouse.
Right.
And that is exactly what has happened.
So let's break that down a little bit, okay? So everyone wants to say that China is a manufacturing powerhouse. And in terms of raw output, totally true. No debate, okay? But if I told you that China has a lot of people, you'd be like, yeah, Dave, everyone knows that, right? If I told you that China employs 212 million people in manufacturing today, whereas the U.S. employs something like 16 million, right? It's 12 million, right? In other words, they employ 16 times more people in manufacturing than we do. In fact, they employ more people in just manufacturing than we do in all areas of our economy. Okay? So when you have 16 times as many people working in manufacturing and you produce 60% more output than the US does, that's not power. That's throwing a lot of people at a very specific thing and getting a lot of output and then being impressed. So the U.S. is the dominant manufacturing superpower on a per capita basis, right? China just has a lot of people, and that is able to offset their inefficiencies at production. Now, in terms of your question about, China's manufacturing increasing and their exports increasing and everything, this is not actually a mystery and is something that a lot of economists, myself included, have been warning about. So let's think about the world before January 2025. There were basically three economic superpowers in the world, right? The US, China, and the EU, okay? And everyone wanted to do business with one of those three, two of those three, maybe all three of those three, okay? What we saw over the last year, over 2025, is basically the U.S. saying, no, don't do business with us, pushing people away, okay? Well, that just leaves two economic superpowers that are really open to trade, China and the EU. Where's everyone going to go? Well, if they're not going to be able to trade with the U.S., they're going to go to China or the EU. So you get a greater share of world international trade flowing through China or the EU. So it's not a mystery that China's exports have increased. They're signing deals with other countries left, right, and center, frankly, at some level faster than the US has been signing deals to negotiate new tariff arrangements.
Yeah.
Right? Everyone wants to do business with China because they can produce a lot of stuff. That's true, right? But also because we have been pushing them away. We have been saying, don't come in here. Don't trade with us. If you want to trade with us, it's going to be expensive. That's what we've been trying to say to the rest of the world, and we've been successful at it, right? And so when people see that, they're going to flock away from the U.S. They're going to run to China. They're going to run to the EU. Mostly China right now. There's a lot of stuff going on with the EU. It's more complicated to deal with than just China. Yep. With China, you basically call President Xi and say, hey, we got a deal? And he can say yes or no. With the EU,
right into the 5-year plan.
Right into the, we'll pencil you in on Tuesday or whatever, right? Yeah. With the EU, there's like committees and all kinds of stuff that has to happen.
Democracy.
Yeah, like democracy, like things we value, right? Yeah. And so, it's frankly more stable, right? But it's slower to deal with the EU than it is to deal with China. China, you pick up the phone, call President Xi and say, hey, and you got a deal, right? So it's not a mystery.
So with this mixed picture of the economy we have, particularly for people who are out of the stock market, out of the real estate market, there's a lot of concern with affordability now on the left and right. And everybody's trying to make a lot of hay about this. This is what I like to refer to. This is different from the Niskin Center. They originally coined this term dark abundance, which was basically a sort of take on Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson's book, and it was sort of the right-wing version of it. They sort of called it that. But I think about this in terms of like things that are likely to make things worse. We see this with some of the rent control initiatives coming out of New York City now. Mm-hmm. We see this all over the place. A common thread is that it's a question of, there's the old meme of guy waiting up late at night and thinking, I just have to subsidize demand. And then he goes through this loop of frustration, and his response again is, I just need to subsidize more demand. Mm-hmm. And this strikes me as the thread line through all of these policies, is all of these policies have this idea that in order to make things more affordable, you have to control prices in some way. You have to make it easier for consumers to purchase it.
Right.
What's the problem with that?
Yeah. So Jared Bernstein had an article in the New York Times about a week ago, right? And I wrote a response, and they did not publish it, which is fine.
They should have. I read it.
I know. It's on my Substack. I love writing letters. I try to write at least one a week. So Bernstein's article was basically saying, look, healthcare, childcare, energy, housing, all four are unaffordable right now. And in his article, he points out, hey, with energy and housing, we can actually deregulate, right? We can make it easier for people to produce these things, right? And that will drive prices down. In other words, it's a supply side phenomenon. Yep. But somehow with healthcare and childcare, this is completely different. There's nothing we can do to increase the supply of these things. The prices just are what they are. They're too high. And so we have to give people or consumers more money to purchase these things to help them get access to the good. Mm-hmm. Okay. And so you're exactly right. What that's going to do is it's going to push on the demand side of the market for those goods, right? When you increase demand, when you shift that demand curve to the right, you are going to get a greater quantity of it, sold, which means more people are going to have that thing, right? Mm-hmm. So there's no debating the change in quantity, right? Yep. But you're also going to get higher prices, okay? And that's basically the story of housing and healthcare over the last 40 years in the U.S. is finding ways to make it easier for people to buy a house or to buy medical care without actually doing much to make it easier for people to build houses or to provide medical care. So the example in healthcare, in 1997, we being Congress, right, passed the Budget Control Act. And what it did is a number of things, but it froze the number of Medicare-funded residency programs at 1996 levels. Yeah. Okay. And so the American Medical Association estimates that we're short something like 80,000 physicians right now, or we will be very shortly. I forget the exact number for today, but it's tens of thousands of physicians that we are short, right? And so what do? Well, we passed the Affordable Care Act. And what does that do? It gives people cheaper access to insurance, which you're never going to find an argument from me to say that people should not have health insurance. That's never going to be my position. I think people should. It's a wonderful thing. It's very helpful. But we didn't actually get any increase in the amount of physicians that are in actual practice right now. It's just been growing at the same rate, about 2% per year. But we basically doubled healthcare spending with the Affordable Care Act. And so if you have twice as much spending and you don't get additional physicians, that's only going to fuel higher prices. Yeah. It's the inevitable result of that. So what we need is not to make things easier to buy. We need to make things easier to produce, right? And this isn't some like zombie Reagan supply side trickle down theory. This is saying that if we can free up people to make things, they can produce more, which means everyone has better access to those things. The same is true in housing. The 50-year mortgage, which it seems President Trump has backed off of, yes, right? Because it would lower your monthly mortgage payments by like $100 or something like that, but cost you an extra hundreds of thousands of dollars over the life of the loan, right? That's not like cheaper mortgages don't build houses, right? Construction workers build houses. Lumber goes into building houses. So if you can find ways to make it easier to build a house, if you can find ways to get more lumber into the hands of construction workers, if you can make it easier to hire construction workers and you're not deporting all of them, you can have more housing. And when you have more housing, housing can become more affordable, right? It's all like in every instance when there's not enough of something or when the price of it's too high, the solution is not giving people more money or capping the price. It's to make it easier to produce it. And if you can do that, quantity will increase, the amount of stuff that's there, and price will come down.
If you build it, they can afford it.
Right? It's amazing.
So there's been a couple of other crazy schemes. I wanted to bring up the 50-year mortgage, and I'm glad you did. I think, there was the golden age of sort of economic crank schemes was like late 19th century, I think. There were all sorts of novel ideas about social credit, free silver, like all sorts of very, very strange things that captured the imaginations of a lot of people.
Yeah.
And one of those very strange things that President Trump has actually just more recently proposed is credit card interest caps, which are very popular with a lot of people on both the left and the right in America. And they say, look at these usurious rates of 25, 30, 35% interest. Why don't we just cap it at 10?
Right.
Why does anybody need more than 10?
Right. Yeah, look, it's a great question, right? So there's a couple of things to note here. One is that you only pay that interest rate if you don't pay off your credit card bill every month.
So it's 0% interest for 30 days.
For 30 days, it's 0% interest, right? So if you pay off your credit card on time every month, you will not pay interest for most credit cards. I'm sure there are some that still charge you some or like an annual fee or whatever, right? But for the most part, you're not paying that 29% if you're paying your bill off every month. Okay, you only pay it if you don't, right? Which I've been hit with the 29%. It's not fun. Okay. The second thing to think about is that 29% is designed to be a deterrent. Right? It's not meant to be like this usurious, hey, let's make as much money as possible off these people. Right? It's meant to be the deterrent. Okay. It's meant to say, hey, I would rather not chase you down for money. I'd rather you just pay your bill on time. Okay. And the last thing to think about is, which economic class of people is the most likely to be hit by that 29%? Well, it's certainly not the Elon Musks, the Jeff Bezos, right? Or anyone above, let's say, $60,000 a year. It's people at the lower end of the income distribution, right? Those are the people that are going to be hit by that 29%. If you take that down to 10%, what's going to happen? Well, what's going to happen is credit card companies are going to say, listen, I'm only going to lend my money to people that I know are going to pay it off, that I wasn't going to get that 29% off of anyway. I'm not going to lend it to people who are delinquent or are going to be late on their payments because I don't want to deal with chasing them down for just 10%. right? It's not going to be worth their time. But that means that lower income people are not going to have access to credit cards. Now, credit cards, if you follow like Dave Ramsey's approach, no one should have a credit card,
Yep.
right? But credit cards can be incredibly helpful, especially for low income people, because it allows you to spend money that you are confident you will get, but you haven't gotten yet. Right? So at some level, credit cards can be a way to avoid those payday advance loans, right?
Most people don't get paid at the end of every day or at the end of every shift. Some
Right.
people do, but most people don't.
Right. So that's the thing is it allows people to smooth their spending while their income might come in chunks, right? Twice a month, once a month maybe, right? If you have a certain job, maybe you're getting, tips for some of your income, right, on a somewhat nightly basis, which is great, but your paycheck is coming in, every 2 weeks instead.
One of the interesting things about this debate is the fact that nobody seems to acknowledge the service being provided for that 30 days and the service in terms of like fraud protection.
Yeah.
These sorts of things. There are all sorts of services that are provided over and above even what you typically think of with credit in terms of credit card rewards.
Right.
There's a lot that goes into, there's a lot of credit card spending that is done because people, think of the security nightmare if everybody's paying by checks that have their bank and their routing number and they're handing those out all over town.
Yeah.
It's the modern economy. This is the sort of thing. If a substantial amount of people, there are a lot of vendors now who do not take cash,
right?
Who are credit card only operators, and people get locked out of that as a result of this sort of change. It's not just that, they can't run up their credit card bills anymore. It's that there are whole classes of goods and services that might not even be open to them anymore.
Right. So there's absolutely that. So cash is becoming very expensive to handle. Right, because with inflation and everything, it takes a lot more cash to buy even simple things.
Yep.
Right, so now you got a whole bunch of cash in your food truck, let's say. Well, now your food truck's a target. So most food trucks, as you note, don't take cash. They use credit cards, right? And the reason is security on their front. But as you were noting, there's also the consumer protections built into credit cards. So when you pay with credit cards money, right, you pay that bill at the end of the month, but in that interim period, it's the credit card that's fronted the money.
Yeah.
Right. And so if something goes awry with a transaction, you can call the credit card company and they'll fight on your behalf to either not pay it or make things right. That's a tremendous protective service to the consumer that is enabled by a credit card. When you're paying with a debit card, for example, that's just money coming straight out of your checking account. Right. There's no protection there. Go ahead and call the bank and say, hey, this payment wasn't correct, or this item didn't come as promised. And they'll just tell you, go deal with the vendor.
Yeah, your money's out of the bank now.
It's gone, right? It's already with them, right? And so when you pay with the credit card company's money, right, it's the credit card company's problem. You can dispute the charge, and they're going to fight on your behalf. That's an amazing service.
We've talked, economy's mixed.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, America's fundamentals are great. We have political chaos that is working against that in a lot of ways. Are there any signs of politicians returning to sort of sound not that they ever fully embraced it,
right?
But it seems like it's gotten worse.
It does. It really does seem like it's gotten worse. And not to be doom and gloom, but it does seem like things are going to get worse before they hopefully get better. So, a lot of the rhetoric, especially coming out of the right and the new right now, is this idea that we face this trade-off between, having cheap stuff and having jobs, right? And so they'll say things like, listen, we've got enough cheap stuff. What we need now are jobs, right?
You just need $2 or $3.
Well, that's the thing, right? You don't need, $37, which, I have a 4-year-old daughter. She does not have $37, right? You don't need 200 pencils. You need 4 or 5, right? Just the basic colors, right? Think back to when we were kids, the Crayola crayon box, right? If your friend had the 64 count, they were like, whoa, right? Yeah. But you and I probably had the 8, maybe the 16 count, right? If we were lucky.
I think I just had crayons.
Yeah, right. I just got the crayons from the restaurant, the 4 colors, right? And so you think about this, right? People will say like, cheap stuff or jobs, right? And okay, they're acknowledging at least that if we restrict international trade, prices are going to go up, Americans are going to have fewer things. And then they allege that the jobs will flow and that the incomes will be higher. And yes, prices will be higher, but incomes will be higher. But if prices are higher and you're only able to afford, $3 instead of 37, that means the price of dolls went up faster than your income. So that's an interesting thing. But they allege, right, that once we get, those foreign goods out, the jobs in America are going to return. And that's just not true, right? There's no evidence that that's actually true at all, right? We saw this with the steel tariffs in 2017 and 2018. In the interim or in the immediate term, right, it basically saved about 1,000 jobs in the steel and aluminum producing sectors, but it cost us 75,000 jobs in the manufacturing sector. In other words, the sectors that use steel and aluminum. But then a wonderful-ish, if you're me and you want to see how bad, protectionism can be, this thing happened where users of aluminum in particular, but also steel, adjusted. So we're in Beer City, USA, right? Did you notice anything about cans of craft beer in 2019, 2020, 2021? Most of them got taller. Right?
Yes.
So you stopped seeing breweries selling 6-packs of regular sized cans and shifting towards selling 4-packs of slightly taller cans. Now, if you do the math, the amount of beer that you purchase was exactly the same, right? I don't have the ounces in front of me, but it's the same amount of beer. It's just
16 ounces. Yeah, 12 ounces, 16 ounces.
Yeah, right? But it's the same amount of beer, but in fewer cans. Mm-hmm. Why is that important? Well, it turns out that the overwhelming majority of the aluminum that's in a can is in the top and the bottom. The side has basically none, right? Mm-hmm. It has some, obviously, because it exists. Yeah. But it's basically none compared to the rest of the can, the top and the bottom, right? If I can reduce tops and bottoms by 50%, think about how much aluminum I'm going to save. That's quite a bit. And when I'm using less aluminum, that means I'm going to buy less aluminum. And when firms buy less aluminum, what do the aluminum manufacturers do? Well, they make less aluminum. Now, they can't fire a machine to cut production, but they can fire people. And so now what we're seeing is that those 1,000 jobs in the aluminum and steel producing sectors that were saved initially, those are going away. So really the net effect here is just negative. Now, I'm hopeful that at some point, logic and truth and this funny little thing called evidence will win the day. Mm-hmm. We're not there just yet. The rhetoric is still too strong, but I'm hopeful that at one day we're going to see, hey, things at the grocery store actually are more expensive. Hey, Detroit's, automotive sector actually is not adding jobs. Hey, there's not actually a resurgence in construction of manufacturing plants in Michigan or in the U.S., right? Yes, sure, there are a couple of plants, but that's not enough to offset the job losses in every other industry in the manufacturing sectors. So I'm hopeful that realization will happen, but I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon.
Dave, I'm not optimistic as well, but I am optimistic. I'm optimistic in the sense that eventually you come up against reality in these situations. And, and as you said earlier, I'm optimistic that the fundamentals underlying the American economy are still very, very strong. The bad part about that is that means that there's a lot of ruin left in a nation, but we have a lot of time to turn it around and to really make America great again.
Right.
Thank you so much for being with us, Dave.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Acton or hear more of this podcast, please visit acton.org/podcasts. Otherwise, we'll see you next week.